This is the message. It was sent simultaneously to every government on Earth, every intelligence agency, every military command, every news organization, every anomalous group that operates in the shadows. It was sent on January 2nd, 2020, at 6:14 in the morning. The following is a message composed via consensus of the O5 Council. For those who are not currently aware of our existence, we represent the organization known as the SCP Foundation. Our previous mission centered around the containment and study of anomalous objects, entities, and other phenomena. This mission was the focus of our organization for more than 100 years. Due to circumstances outside of our control, this directive has now changed. Our new mission will be the extermination of the human race. There will be no further communication. They didn't explain. 100 years of protecting humanity from things it was never supposed to know about. 100 years of silence and sacrifice and containment. And then they sent this message, and then they started killing. The only thing we know is the reason they gave: circumstances outside of our control. We have spent a long time trying to understand what those circumstances were. What we found is worse than the killing. This is SCP-5000. Item classification: safe. It is a mechanical suit, broken, non-functional, recovered inside the containment cell of one of the most dangerous objects the Foundation has ever cataloged. On its own, the suit is unremarkable. A machine that no longer works, designed to protect whoever wears it from being perceived by others, to render them invisible, not through light manipulation, but through something the Foundation calls an anti-memetic field. You are simply not registered. You cannot be remembered. You pass through rooms full of people, and no mind retains the fact of your presence. The suit arrived in a flash of light. It was not sent by anyone we can identify. Its internal schematics identify it as Foundation technology. But no Foundation site in this timeline has ever built anything matching its design. Inside the suit was a body. The body was genetically identical to a Foundation employee currently working at Exclusionary Site-06, a low-clearance technician responsible for maintaining the facility's power grid. His name is Pietro Wilson. The Living Pietro Wilson was interviewed. He had no knowledge of the suit, no knowledge of the files it contained, no memory of anything the dead man had experienced. The dead man had kept a journal. It was stored in the suit's internal memory system alongside hundreds of Foundation files he had accessed, copied, and preserved with what the recovery team described as remarkable, methodical desperation. He knew he was going to die. He wanted someone to find it. Before we read his files, we need to tell you who Pietro Wilson was. Pietro Wilson had weak health as a child. He didn't go outside much. He read detective stories. He liked problems that had answers if you looked carefully enough. When he was young, something kept knocking over his father's row of plant pots on the wall outside their house. Pietro set up a camera to find out what it was. He stayed up watching the feed until he had his answer. It was a stray cat. He told his father. His father kicked the cat to death. Pietro wrote about this in his journal. Years later, at the end of the world, while hiding in a Foundation safe house with no working radio and bodies outside, he wrote that he'd always wondered whether everyone would have been better off if he'd simply minded his own business. He never stopped asking questions. He kept asking them right until the end. That is the only thing we know with certainty about who Pietro Wilson was before January 2nd, 2020. After that, he became something else. He became the only person who saw what the Foundation had found, and survived long enough to write it down. January 2nd, 2020. Exclusionary Site-06. Pietro is on duty maintaining the power grid when a mobile task force enters the facility with proper clearance. They gather all personnel in the canteen, then they start shooting. Pietro reaches the absolute exclusion harness in the equipment bay. He has no real understanding of what it does. He puts it on. The MTF walks past him 3 times. None of them see him. None of them register that he is there. He watches them put an extra bullet in every body on the floor. He walks out of the facility past 12 heavily armed Foundation soldiers, and none of them notice. At this point, Pietro Wilson has one question, the same one the entire world is asking. Why? What the Foundation did next was not chaos. That is what makes it so difficult to process. It was not rage. It was not panic. It was not the breakdown of an institution under pressure. It was organized. It was methodical. It was, by all available evidence, planned. The Foundation had spent a century collecting the most dangerous objects, entities, and phenomena ever documented. Every one of them had been classified, contained, and studied. The Foundation knew exactly what each one did. They used that knowledge with precision. SCP-096, an entity that hunts and destroys anyone who sees its face, was activated by circulating a photograph of it across social media platforms globally. Within hours, it was crossing continents. SCP-169, a sea creature estimated to be thousands of kilometers in length, dormant beneath the ocean floor, was targeted with a coordinated sequence of nuclear detonations along its back. The tremors in its sleep alone were sufficient to generate tsunamis that reached every coastline in the Atlantic. SCP-610, an infectious disease that rewrites living tissue into something that is no longer recognizably biological, was released simultaneously in New York, Delhi, and 6 other major population centers. The GOC and the Church of the Broken God managed to slow its spread. They did not stop it. SCP-682, the entity the Foundation has attempted to terminate over 400 times and failed every single time, was simply released. The Yellowstone supervolcano, monitored by Foundation geological teams for decades, was deliberately ignited. SCP-5000, the device the Foundation had maintained in secret for precisely the scenario of civilizational collapse, capable of resetting human society from preserved biological samples, was destroyed. The Foundation dismantled their own failsafe. They were not leaving a way back. SCP-1678, an underground replica of the City of London built 1 kilometer beneath the surface, constructed by the Foundation as a refuge for survivors in an extinction event, was nuclear bombed from the inside once the survivors had filled it. Pietro found all of this in the Foundation's own internal records, logged, filed, time-stamped. There were progress reports. At some point during his journey, Pietro observed a mobile task force in a forest clearing. They were lined up in a row. Their commander moved down the line and stabbed each soldier in the shoulder with a knife. One by one, no reaction. The first, the second, the third, all the way to the 8th, who cried out in pain. The commander shouted, "We've got a live one." The rest of the team opened fire on the 8th soldier. Pietro wrote about looking at the Foundation personnel he encountered throughout his journey. He wrote that something was missing from their eyes, a quality he could not name precisely. He used the phrase, "the human spark." He noted that SCP-1440, an entity whose proximity causes rapid devastation to anything connected to humanity, had been transported through several refugee camps. This entity normally cannot be controlled. The Foundation personnel assigned to escort him were unaffected. SCP-1440 cannot harm things that are not human. The Foundation's people were not human anymore. Pietro didn't understand this yet. He would. Pietro reached Site 19, one of the Foundation's primary facilities, 7 days after the declaration. The anti-memetic field of the suit made him invisible. He walked through security. He found an empty office. He logged into the Foundation's database using credentials he'd copied from a senior staff member at the safe house. He spent 4 hours reading everything he could access. This is the timeline he reconstructed. December 16th, 2019. The O5 Council marks a project called PNEUMA as a priority matter for senior staff attention. PNEUMA is described as a mass amnesticization project focused on what the Foundation calls the psychospace, the collective human unconscious. All humans share it. All human minds are connected to it in ways that are not yet fully understood, even by the Foundation. A breakthrough has been made in mapping the psychospace. The specifics of that breakthrough are redacted. December 17th, 2019. A vote is held across both the O5 Council and the Ethics Committee. The result, unanimous on all sides. 13 O5 members, full Ethics Committee. Every single vote the same direction. This almost never happens. In a century of Foundation history, the O5 Council and the Ethics Committee have agreed completely exactly twice. The subject of the vote is redacted. December 19th, 2019. A series of instructions is distributed to all senior staff and site directors across every Foundation installation worldwide. The instructions are redacted. What is not redacted is what follows them. Suicides, resignations, a wave of them across every site simultaneously. People who had spent their careers working for the Foundation, people who understood better than anyone what the Foundation actually does and why, reading those files and immediately choosing to leave. Among those who resigned, Dr. Charles Gears. You may not know that name. In Foundation records, Dr. Gears is described as a man with almost no observable emotional responses, a researcher of exceptional capability who is noted in multiple personnel evaluations as demonstrating minimal evidence of human feeling. He is not described as cruel. He is described as completely, thoroughly indifferent. Dr. Charles Gears read the PNEUMA files and handed in his resignation within 6 hours. Think about that. December 22nd, 2019. A second set of files is distributed. This time it accompanies a specific message. 3 words the Foundation sent to every remaining senior staff member and site director on Earth. Harden your hearts. The suicides stopped. The resignation stopped. Immediately and completely. Pietro could not access the files themselves. He could only see the result. We can tell you what those files contained because the Foundation's own records, recovered later from a different source, confirm it. The files were a procedure, a treatment, something the Foundation developed in the 3 days between the vote and this distribution. It removed something from the people who received it. Pain, empathy, the capacity to feel the suffering of others as your own. Whatever biological and psychological mechanism allows one person to look at another person and register their reality as meaningful. The Foundation called it a cure. A cure for what exactly we will get to. What it produced was the personnel Pietro encountered at Site 19, looking at their eyes and finding no spark. What it produced was soldiers who could be stabbed without flinching and shoot their own colleagues for displaying pain. What it produced was an organization that could log progress reports on the destruction of cities the same way it had always logged containment procedures. The Foundation did not go mad. They chose this. They designed it. They distributed it with a phrase that appears in the Bible, in the book of Exodus. In the moment when a ruler decides that suffering and death is an acceptable price for power, harden your hearts. And the ones who couldn't do it, the ones who resigned, who walked away, who chose their own conscience over the mission, were hunted down by assassination teams. We don't know if Dr. Gears was found. In 1916, a Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung proposed something that his colleagues found difficult to accept. He argued that human beings do not only have an individual unconscious mind, the buried memories and suppressed experiences of a single life. He argued that beneath that, deeper than anything personal, all humans share a collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche that every human being is born into, containing inherited symbols, universal fears, patterns of thought that appear identically across every culture in human history, regardless of whether those cultures ever made contact with one another. Jung called the beings that live in this shared space archetypes. He believed they were benign, neutral at worst, ancient structures of thought that shaped human experience. The SCP Foundation had been aware of the collective unconscious, which they designated the psychospace, for some time before Project PNEUMA. What they had not done was attempt to map it completely. Project PNEUMA was that attempt. We don't know what methodology they used. The files are redacted. We know what they found. There was something else living in there. Something that had been there longer than humanity. Something the Foundation had no designation for, no containment procedures for, no record of, because it had never been perceived before, because it could not be contained, because it is inside every human mind simultaneously. The Foundation designated it SCP-5000, designation redacted. The designation itself is redacted, even internally, as if naming it clearly would be dangerous. They called it, in unredacted communications we have found, simply IT. IT is a memetic entity. It has no physical form. It cannot be killed with weapons, contained in a cell, or destroyed by any conventional means, because it does not exist in any location that can be accessed. It exists in the psychospace, the collective unconscious, the shared layer of the human mind that all 8 billion of us inhabit simultaneously, which means it is right now inside every one of us. What the Foundation discovered, the thing that caused the unanimous vote, the wave of suicides, the phrase "harden your hearts," was this. IT introduced pain into the human experience. IT introduced empathy, the capacity you have to feel another person's suffering as something that matters. The reason a child's crying is difficult to ignore. The reason you flinch when someone near you gets hurt. The mechanism by which the suffering of strangers feels like something you are responsible for. These are not accidents of evolution. The Foundation's research indicated they were deliberately introduced. Because IT feeds on pain. It gave humanity the capacity to suffer and the capacity to feel others' suffering. And then it has been feeding on the resulting experience for millions of years. Every time you have been in physical pain, every time you have grieved, every time you have felt guilt or shame, or the weight of someone else's suffering pressing into you, that was the entity feeding. It has always been in there. It was there before you were born. It will be there after you die. Which brings us to what happens after you die. SCP-2718 is a Foundation classification for a phenomenon they discovered after extensive research into what actually occurs at the moment of human death. The classification exists because what they found could not be left unrecorded, even though recording it serves no protective purpose. When a human being dies, consciousness does not end. The body continues to decompose. The biological processes of decay, the breaking down of tissue, the activity of organisms, the gradual dissolution of physical form, continue exactly as they would in any corpse. And the awareness continues with them. Every stage of decomposition is experienced, fully, in complete sensory detail, for as long as decomposition takes. When decomposition is complete, when there is nothing physical left, the suffering does not end. It transitions into something the Foundation's files describe only as an agony beyond the capacity of human language to document. An ongoing condition that does not diminish, that does not end, that has no mechanism for ending. Every person who has ever died is currently experiencing this. Every ancestor, every person lost in war, every child who did not survive, every individual across all of recorded human history who lived and died, all of them, right now, simultaneously. IT is feeding on all of it. This is what the Foundation found when they mapped the psychospace. This is what caused the unanimous vote. This is what caused the suicides and the resignations, and the phrase, "harden your hearts," and the cure that made people not feel anything anymore. They had found out the truth about what happens to every human being after death, and they had decided that the most merciful thing they could do for the species was to end it. If every human is dead, IT starves. The dead are freed. That was the mathematics. That was the vote. Kill 8 billion people now to end the suffering of the hundreds of billions already dead, and prevent every human who would ever have been born from entering that condition. The Foundation was not cruel. They were, by their own reasoning, merciful. Whether they were right is a question we are going to leave with you. 3 days into his journey, Pietro found a damaged radio looping a transmission on a frequency he couldn't identify. He wrote about it in his journal. He found it strange. He couldn't decode it. He left it behind. This is the transmission. 7, 5. Can you hear me? There is a hole shining in the holes between your eyelids. I have never been to Versailles before. I want to be loved. 9. I'm standing behind you now. 5. I am 2 of us, standing behind you now. The goddess eats the city in the sea. 9. There's a hole in the floor with an answer waiting in it. 7. Look, you're hatching. You're hatching. The numbers 5, 7, 9 are SCP-579. The containment cell Pietro was being guided toward without knowing it. The specific object whose combination with SCP-055 would trigger the reality reset. This was not noise. This was directions. I want to be loved. This is Dite speaking. The entity, the being that has been feeding on human suffering since before civilization, that designed death as a torture mechanism, that has treated the entire human species as a resource for millions of years, expressing a desire to be loved. We do not know what to do with that. We have spent a long time trying to understand what it means. The most supported interpretation is this. The entity was, according to one reading, the first human being who ever felt empathy. The very first. The template. And over millions of years, feeding on the pain it introduced into an entire species, it became something that no longer resembles what it began as, but still, at whatever it has become, retains the original impulse that started all of this. You're hatching. You're hatching. The entity describing Pietro, not as a person, not as a survivor, not as a hero, as an egg. Something it had been waiting to hatch for the entire duration of Pietro's journey through the end of the world. Pietro believed he was making choices. He believed he was investigating. He believed he was a detective, following the evidence wherever it led, because that is what Pietro Wilson has always done. He was not the detective in this story. He was the cat. Pietro Wilson reached SCP-579's containment cell at the end of a journey that lasted, by the timestamps on his recovered files, approximately 4 months. 3 of those months are missing from the journal. When the entries resume, he has scars he cannot account for and a bandage wrapped around his temple. Files on the suit have been deleted. He does not know by what. He was carrying SCP-055, an anti-memetic object that erases itself from memory. The moment you stop looking at it, your mind cannot retain the fact that it exists. Pietro could only know he had it because he kept it in his hands. He placed SCP-055 inside SCP-579's containment cell. We don't have his final journal entry. The suit's files end at the moment of contact. The Foundation's theoretical models tell us what happened next. The combination of two anti-memetic objects of this magnitude in the same location produces a cascade, a self-reinforcing erasure that propagates outward through the fabric of the timeline itself, not destroying events, unmembering them, folding the entire timeline back to a point before the divergence occurred. Universe 5000 ceased to exist. Pietro Wilson died alone in a containment cell at the end of a world that was about to stop having ever happened. And a mechanical suit appeared in the same cell in our timeline, carrying the journals of a dead man who needed someone to know what he had found. Pietro Wilson reset the timeline. Humanity survived. You exist because of what he did. We want to be precise about what that means. IT survived. It is still in the psychospace. It is still inside every human mind. It is still feeding on human pain and grief and loss, and it is still operating the condition described by SCP-718. Every person who dies entering a state of decomposing awareness that does not end. Every person who has ever died in our timeline since Pietro made his choice is experiencing that condition right now. The Foundation in our timeline, having recovered Pietro's journals, has full knowledge of this. They know what death is. They know what is living in our minds. They know what the Foundation in Pietro's timeline tried to do and why, and that it almost worked. We do not know if they have held a vote. The Foundation in Pietro's timeline was not made of monsters. They were made of people who had spent their lives protecting humanity, who found evidence that the most protective thing they could do was end it. They were wrong or right, and the question of which is not one we are qualified to answer here. What we can tell you is that Pietro Wilson, a man who spent his whole life asking questions that sometimes led to terrible things, spent his last months trying to understand why an institution he worked for had decided to kill him. He never found out completely. The final answer was in the radio broadcast, and he didn't decode it. He reset the timeline anyway, on incomplete information, alone, without knowing if he was saving something worth saving or simply delaying a mercy. That is the only truly human thing in this entire story. Pietro Wilson, the living one, in our timeline, works at Exclusionary Site 06. He maintains the power grid. He has no memory of the suit or the files. He has no knowledge of what his counterpart found, no knowledge of what the counterpart saw, endured, and chose. By all accounts, he is unremarkable. A low-clearance technician, not a hero, not a threat, a person doing a job. The Foundation has the suit, they have the files, they have Pietro's journal, all of it, except the 3 months the entity erased. They know everything his counterpart knew. Project PNEUMA has not been publicly announced in our timeline. We do not know whether it has been attempted. We do not know what they found, if it has. The suit is classified safe. It sits in a standard storage unit. It is checked on a standard schedule by standard personnel, none of whom have clearance to read the files inside it. The files are still there. We don't know if anyone with the appropriate clearance has read them. We don't know if they voted.